36-year-old Nancy Moyer was single for the first time in her adult life. She had a great job, 2 daughters whom she absolutely adored, and she had her freedom. In early 2009, she was rediscovering herself. She was dating and figuring out her future. But on the weekend of March 6, 2009, Nancy Moyer disappeared. Police quickly began to suspect foul play, but who would want to hurt Nancy? As the investigation went on, a number of suspects came to light, but it would be a decade before one of them dropped a bombshell that changed the direction of the case forever. When a person goes missing, there's a special kind of pain in the not knowing. I want to tell you the stories of those who never came home. Today, I want to tell you the story of Nancy Moyer. I'm Kona Gallagher.
And I'm Ethan Flick.
And this is And Then They Were Gone. Welcome back, everyone.
Welcome back. It's been so long.
I know, so long. I mean, for everybody not on our Patreon, it's been a very normal amount of time, 1 week, since you looked at me. Really?
Is that a Bare Naked Ladies reference?
Yeah.
Moving on.
Okay. But yes, if you're on Patreon, you are perhaps listening to us just mere hours or minutes after our last episode. But this week, we are continuing to talk about Nancy Moyer, and we're talking about the case from 2012 to the present. So last week, if you haven't listened to it, you got to listen because none of this is going to make sense. We talked about Nancy Moyer's life. We talked about her disappearance and the initial investigation. What we're covering this week is when the case got reassigned to a different detective 3 years later and, what I call phase 2, basically. So we're going to do all that and then also talk a little bit about where some of the key players are now. So let's get into it and continue the story of Nancy Moyer.
Yeah, let's get into it.
When we left off last week, it was 2012 and Detective Ben Elkins had just been assigned Nancy's case. He started from the beginning and he began to re-interview people. In 2013, he spoke with Jim Roth. Jim was Nancy's coworker. They had apparently been on a few dates, though no one in the office knew about this. And I do know this because, I mentioned in the last episode that Bev had posted on the Web Sleuths forum a little bit. And people are like, well, what about that weird other coworker that she had the dates with? And she's like, yeah, I don't know. Nobody knew about that because he was married and we thought he was still married, but he had stopped wearing his wedding ring.
I think that's all part of it. I don't think that they actually went on dates.
Yeah, I don't know. So we're going to get into it. But yeah, so Bev, nobody had any idea about any of this. So it was a shock to all of them, basically. Like we covered last week, he had left messages on Nancy's answering machine the weekend she disappeared, but he didn't volunteer this information to police. When he was interviewed initially, he said that he was home all night with his sons on Friday and didn't leave. But on Saturday, he drove to her house a half an hour away and found the front door open. He went inside to look for her and then left when she wasn't there.
Yeah, because that's a normal...
Just a totally chill thing to do.
Just be like,
yeah.
Hey, Nancy, are you home?
Yeah.
Oh, no? I guess I'm going to wander around your house.
Not find you and then tell nobody for a week after you're reported missing.
And then there's the whole story about his impotence.
Yeah. Which nobody asked about.
I'm telling you, there's something else going on there. I think it was more an obsession and less of dating.
Yeah, okay. So let's talk about it. So again, it's 2013, 4 years after Nancy's disappearance. Detective Elkins brings Jim Roth in. Jim agrees to come in and just says, hey, listen, start from the beginning. Like, I'm the new guy. I don't know anything. Tell me everything. And, of course, like by this time, Jim's like read the case file backwards and forwards. Like he's probably memorized the entire thing. But Jim does. He goes through the whole thing. And Elkins immediately notices some inconsistencies.
Oh, weird.
This time, instead of Jim and Nancy having like hooked up once, but him not being able to perform, Jim tells Detective Elkins that like, yeah, they hooked up and they had sex and it was like normal and fine. Everything was cool.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Detective Elkins was like, okay, gotcha. You had this intimate relationship with her. Like, tell me about her tattoos. Because
nice tactic. I like this.
Yeah, because some of them were pretty visible. Like I mentioned the armband, right? And so I don't know if she wore short sleeves at work or not, but like theoretically.
There's potential. Same thing with her foot tattoo. Like
exactly.
She could have
worn sandals. Yeah, anything, right? Yeah. So like there are some that like definitely anyone could have potentially seen.
Right, but where's the Playboy bunny? Where's the butterfly?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And like there were several, because again, there were 6 total, and several of them were definitely like in places that somebody who was not intimate with her would have seen. Like one was on her hip, like these are places that definitely would have been covered up in normal day-to-day life.
But also, if he hadn't seen them, that does not necessarily mean that he wasn't intimate with her.
I mean, listen, for sure, right? I mean, because we don't
know the circumstances of how that transpired, but let's go.
Correct. But the point is that he could not describe her tattoos or, say much about them at all.
Any of them. Right.
Detective Elkins, at this point, is absolutely on your wavelength. And he's like, I feel like if your story is true and she spent the night at your house and you had this like whole evening together,
right,
that you'd be able to tell me a little bit more.
You might have noticed just maybe one tattoo that wasn't visible.
Yeah, like just a little bit.
Yeah.
Something. And he couldn't. So he starts wondering if there was any actual relationship at all, or if Jim was just obsessed with Nancy.
I mean, that's what I get.
Yeah.
Especially now that he's changed his story. So the initial story was I couldn't perform.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, him inserting himself into her life, but coming up with an excuse as to why they hadn't been actually intimate.
Mm-hmm.
Not rejection.
Right. Like, it's not that she wasn't into him.
Right. Which is probably what happened.
Right.
And then he became obsessed with her, or he already was obsessed with her.
Yeah.
Now we're 4 years ahead, and now he feels comfortable saying that they had this intimate relationship, even though that didn't exist, because presumably that evidence, if there was any, which there probably wouldn't be.
Right. Would be long gone.
Right.
I mean, it's weeks we're talking about here.
Right. So it's all in his head. That's what I get.
Yeah. And, I don't know, but that is also what the detective was thinking. He was just like, I don't know that they ever dated at all, much less like had an intimate relationship.
Right. So you have this person that's obsessed. He calls trying to set up an additional date, or any date, because who knows, and potentially feels rejected. I mean, this is prime suspect number 1.
Yeah.
For me now.
And for them too.
Yeah. Like this is clearly going in a direction where he's obsessed with her. He feels rejected. Murder.
Yeah. And, even in the disappeared episode, they were like, listen, like we've seen this story before with like rock stars, with actors, where somebody gets obsessed and thinks they have a relationship with this person.
Yes.
And then they end up killing them.
Right.
This is a thing that is horrible, but it happens. So that's kind of what they were thinking. So, they didn't know. The only reason I would think that perhaps they maybe did go out once or twice or, something like that. I feel like there was something there because he did have her home phone number, which he wouldn't have necessarily had just being a coworker who had asked her out on a date and gotten turned down.
But he didn't have her cell phone number.
Potentially. We don't know 100%, but you're right. Like we don't have any proof that he had called her cell phone. Exactly. But he also knew where she lived. And he said it was because he picked her up for a date there. But again, like maybe he just looked her up in the phone book, I think that there's a potential that there was something like she threw him a bone kind of thing.
Which probably started the obsession, honestly.
Right. Yeah. Because she was super nice and she was like dating and she was, kind of like trying new things and doing whatever. So I could see her just saying like, yeah, sure. Like maybe not being into it, but
here's my home phone number instead of my cell phone.
Right.
So I can screen your fucking calls.
Yeah. And I can put you on my physical answering machine.
Yes.
That lives in my house.
Also, like, who has an answering machine?
It was 2009. People still had them.
Did you? I didn't.
Not in 2009.
I don't think I even had a landline.
No, I had a landline, but
anyway.
Yeah. So I don't know. Like, I feel like there could have been something, like you said, but that started the obsession, or it could have been even creepier, which is like there was nothing. And he just looked her up.
Yeah. I mean, do we know?
Because in 2009, they had stopped delivering the yellow pages on your doorstep, but you could still easily go to yellowpages.com and find somebody's address and phone number.
Do we know what he actually does for the company? I mean, he could have looked up her information via
like through a company directory or something like that. Yeah, no, I have no idea. I don't know what he did.
So there's that possibility.
Mm-hmm.
Either way, her home address and home phone number could easily have been found.
Yeah, for sure. In addition to changing his story about like their, romantic night together, he also said that he went over to Nancy's house on Friday, not Saturday. So this completely changes his alibi.
Yeah, and that skews the timeline.
Yeah, completely. So like that's a big deal, but unfortunately, it's 4 years later. So it's not like they can prove if this is an admission or just a mix-up in dates 4 years after the fact.
Yeah.
Even though this guy's changing his story, he seems super creepy. The detective is very suspicious. Like they still don't have anything.
Right. It's all circumstantial evidence at this point.
So they have literally nothing that they could get warrants for, that they can hold him on. Like nothing at all. Obviously, they interviewed him. They said, thank you for your time, and they let him go.
I would be curious to know what his behavior has been since then.
Well, so I also looked that up.
Okay.
All right. So what I can tell you is that right before Nancy's disappearance, so she went missing in March of 2009. In February of 2009, he was arrested for a DUI.
Do we have any kind of time frame of when he and his wife split up?
I don't know that. I wasn't able to find that out.
Because I'm just curious as to he and his wife break up. I'm wondering if there was extreme thing that happens in his life, like a divorce, split up, whatever, and then he starts spiraling. So now there's a DUI right before she goes missing.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's a DUI right before she goes missing. Nothing else, but then several years after, I don't remember off the top of my head, I want to say around 2014, he was arrested for another DUI.
Okay, so not indicative of
like a specific trigger, more of just like a general problem with alcohol.
Yeah. So still nothing there to act on.
Exactly. So those are the two main things that I could find. I mean, I don't have it in front of me. There may have been like, I don't know, traffic tickets or whatever, but like those are the two big things that I saw. So the DUI right before and the DUI several years later.
Either way, not something you can directly connect to, an obsession and a kidnapping or whatever.
Not at all. And as for what Jim would have to say about this today, we don't know because he passed away in 2017. But he always maintained his innocence. However, he remained the man that many people in Nancy's life thought killed her.
I mean, at this point, he's the only suspect that makes sense.
To everybody, right? To police, to her family, to her friends. Like, they had nobody else other than Bernard Howell.
Right, which would be relatively random.
Exactly. Like, yes, they did. It seems like they did cross paths, so it wasn't like completely random,
right.
But still weird. It didn't seem like they had like an actual personal relationship.
Right. Like, how would he have known that she was home that weekend? Unless he was just like sitting on the house.
Yeah. I don't know.
I guess the same could be said about Jim. Like, how would Jim have known?
Right.
Unless he was watching the house.
Yeah. So I don't know. So at this point, we're talking like 2013. We've got Jim, who is pretty much everybody's prime suspect. And then you've got Bernard Howell, who is kind of like a secondary, like it could be true. He murdered somebody nearby. He's obviously a very sick guy. We don't know, so that's where we are. And that's where it stays until 2019 when a third man confesses to murdering Nancy. On July 9th, 2019, a man named Eric Lee Roberts called 911 and told the dispatcher that he had killed Nancy Moyer in 2009 and was tired of holding it in. So who the hell is Eric Roberts?
Julia Roberts' brother.
I know. That poor man and his Google search results, honestly. But no, this is not Julia Roberts' brother. This is just some guy, which is like why they put Eric Lee. That's why you use the middle name with killers, because sometimes it's Julia Roberts' brother, but he didn't do anything.
Also, anybody whose middle name is Lee is like automatically going to kill somebody.
Well, and Wayne. Those are the two that are bad. But anyway, so Eric Lee Roberts, is yet another coworker of Nancy's.
Come on, really?
I know. Like,
all right. No, tell me the confession.
No, I will. But I feel like the Washington State Department of Ecology has to be like UPMC in Pittsburgh, where it's like the company friggin' store or whatever. Like everybody works there, it seems like. I can't believe how many coworkers are involved in this story. But yeah, so he worked at the Department of Ecology, but it doesn't seem like they were close like she was with many of her other coworkers. They weren't carpooling or anything like that.
Or going on made up dates.
No, yeah, right. Okay. Like nothing like that. But working together wasn't their only connection. Nancy had dated his nephew, Aaron Huntley, when she was first splitting with Bill. In addition to that, Eric lives 3 houses down from the home that Nancy had shared with Bill. So they were neighbors for many years.
So how do we go from that to him killing her, though?
Good question. Glad you asked. So because he was a coworker, Eric was interviewed by police during the original investigation.
He was not?
No, he was.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, he was interviewed because they interviewed basically everybody there.
Right.
And during that, he said that he didn't really know Nancy that well. Like, he definitely knew who she was. And, they would say hi or whatever, but they weren't friends. They didn't hang out. You know, they would sometimes see each other in the neighborhood. Maybe they would chat at work, but like that was about the extent of their relationship. What I'm about to tell you is the story that got released to the media in 2019, in July. On July 9th, 2019, Eric Roberts called 911 and said that he wanted to report a murder. The dispatcher asked him who was murdered, and he said that he had killed Nancy Moyer 10 years ago and was tired of holding it in. The probable cause affidavit then says, quote, Eric stated that he was aware that it was a recorded line and was reluctant to give further details. He did say that he knew Nancy Moyer and that she was, quote, gone, end quote. He then gave the dispatcher his full name, birth date, and address and said, quote, I don't think anyone will be able to find her, end quote. Like, this is it, you know, right? This 10-year-old mystery that devastated this small town is finally over. A guy confessed.
I mean, I'm assuming that's not the case because then we wouldn't be doing an episode on it.
Yeah, accurate. Certainly not a two-parter in any case. Detectives had to have been like, oh my God, this just dropped into our lap. This is amazing. So they rushed over to Roberts' house to talk to him. According to police, when they arrived, Eric was standing on the front porch. He then told them that he killed Nancy and left her in the hills. He then offered to give a recorded statement, so detectives took them to their patrol car to do so.
This is all sounding too good to be true.
Well, exactly, right? The recording that they did in the patrol car is 34 minutes long. Now, so keep in mind, this is what we've got so far. We have the 911 call, which is recorded. We have his statement on the porch, which is not recorded.
Right.
But then we have this 34-minute recording in the patrol car. During this, an emotional Eric Roberts said again that he killed her. He told detectives that she attacked him and, quote, I just reacted, end quote. He also admitted on the tape to having a sexual relationship with Nancy. Then he asked them to stop the recording.
Why?
Apparently, and you know, of course, so this information is coming from the probable cause affidavit. They haven't obviously released the actual recordings of this,
sure,
right?
Yeah.
But according to the affidavit, Eric was very emotional, freaking out, like very just, you know, all over the place during this recording. And so he was like, okay, he told them this. It was 34 minutes. And he's like, all right, stop the recording. I've got more to tell you, but I don't want it to be on tape. So they stopped the recording. And according to the detectives, Eric immediately relaxed. He like calmed down, and he also changed his story.
Go ahead.
According to detectives, after they stopped the recording, Eric told them that what actually happened was that he and Nancy were having sex, and Nancy liked to be choked. So he did that and accidentally strangled her to death. He allegedly said, quote, I didn't mean for it to happen.
Okay. So get to the part of disposing of the body then.
Okay, yeah. No, I will.
So, okay, sure. No evidence of that whatsoever, but not necessarily that there would be. But I'm curious to hear what he says about how he got rid of her body.
Right. So initially, when he was on the recording, he was saying that she attacked him and he reacted. He said that was further on the land. You know, they were outside. She attacked him, he reacted, and she was like out in the hills, quote unquote, right?
Okay.
Then apparently when the recording stopped and he changed his story and said that this was an accidental death that happened, you know, while they were having sex, he said that. And then according again to this document, he freaked out. And so detectives asked him if he wanted to go take a walk. And he said yes. So they left the patrol car, they went and took a walk, and they ended up at this large fire pit that he has on his property. And according to detectives, Roberts then said, quote, "I don't really want to incriminate myself any further, but if I was going to get rid of a body on my property, it would be right there," end quote.
Okay. Where does the coat come in?
Good question, because it actually does come back. I'm glad, like, look at you remembering the coat that I mentioned very briefly.
That's why I kept asking. I want to know how he disposed of her body.
Yeah.
I want to, if he mentioned the coat, then that's it. He did it 100% because that's
right.
Not something that probably would have been released to the public. It's just something.
Yeah, it was released to the public because it was in something I read. I don't remember when it was released, right? Like if it was released immediately or like many years later or what. Okay. But yeah, so I don't know. But it was definitely released prior to his confession. So I will say that much. So there is like some possibility that even if he had talked about the coat, that he could have just known that from news articles.
Fair.
But no, I am glad that you brought it up because it does come back right now. Again, this is all according to detectives because they had turned off the recorder. He then said that he burned a scarf that Nancy had been wearing because it disgusted him and that the rest of her clothes were in his basement. So the 911 call and the confession was made on July 9th. On July 10th, Eric Roberts was arrested for second-degree murder, possession of a dangerous weapon, and unlawful possession of a short firearm. He was held in jail while a search warrant was executed on his property. Police brought in excavators and dug all around his home. And I should mention that this neighborhood is full of homes. Like it is a neighborhood, right? But it's full of homes on large lots. So Eric's property is 6.5 acres.
Jesus.
Yeah. And like, I said that Bill and Nancy lived 3 doors down, and they did, but their property was also like 6+ acres, whatever. So what it was is basically a row of houses that are relatively close together, but have a lot of acreage in the back. Like the lots just go like straight back.
Okay. I was going to say, because relatively close together, that's like 18, if each one has 6 acres.
Right. No, but the lots go back. And so it does, if you look at Google Maps and you look at just the houses.
Just have really large backyards.
Yeah, like extremely large. So here's where it gets crazy. And I am getting back to the code, I promise. A day after this confession at his home, Eric Roberts recanted it all.
I can't with this fucking case. Okay.
I know. He said that he didn't remember making the 911 call or confessing anything to police.
Oh, okay. So now he conveniently had a psychotic break when whatever and what?
No, he said that he was on medication and that was potentially why he would have made that call and confessed to Nancy's murder.
Whatever this mysterious medication is made him confess to a murder.
Yeah.
Not buying it.
He was arrested for murder. He was arrested for these gun charges. But, once he got to jail, prosecutors understandably declined to charge Roberts with murder because the sheriff's department had just gotten the search warrant. They had just started looking at his house. They wanted to wait. They wanted to wait until they performed the searches. They wanted to wait.
Yeah, until they could build a better case.
Exactly.
Sure.
Yeah. So they didn't want to charge him right away and start the whole trial process. They wanted to get a better case. Exactly. So he wasn't charged. He was arrested for the murder. He was not charged for the murder.
But there was still probable cause to execute the search.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So they were able to get the search warrants. So he was released from Thurston County Jail shortly thereafter, like the next day or the day after, whatever it was. But then he was promptly rearrested and put into federal custody for those gun charges.
There you go.
Yeah. But they didn't do a great job at that because those charges were quickly dismissed. So what they had accused him of was having basically a sawed-off shotgun.
Yeah.
Which, like, you're not allowed to have, apparently.
Yeah, you can't self-modify.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they're like, you have a sawed-off shotgun. We're going to arrest you. You know, he went into federal custody. But then when they looked at the gun, they're like, oh, this is not actually a sawed-off shotgun. He says it was a pistol. I don't know what it actually was, but it was not a sawed-off shotgun. So the charges got quickly dismissed.
Cool.
So he was released, but then on July 19th, he was put in a third jail in Snohomish County on a warrant for domestic violence assault.
Oh, which has nothing to do with this investigation.
Yeah, right? Exactly.
Interesting.
So, this was a warrant that had been out, for a while, whatever, not directly involved, but yes, I would say
it was a non-extraditable warrant that was known. However, since he was in custody, perhaps the feds who had him in custody at that point did that county a favor.
Right.
And transported.
Exactly. So he went into the Snohomish County Jail on this warrant, but again, he was released after 10 days, 11 days.
But how? Okay, so now we've got all of this time where they were performing searches.
Exactly.
So what did they come up with?
Yeah, so that gave them the time to go into the house, to go into the basement.
Yes, and also to the listeners that, yes, this is literally how law enforcement can fuck you over.
Mm-hmm.
Because, yes, that warrant was out for a while on the domestic, but it was not extraditable, and he wasn't living there.
It was like a 4th degree felony,
Yeah, but if they had him in custody and he was potentially linked to something else, well, maybe somebody does a favor and drives him down there.
Yeah. And that's exactly what happened. And we've seen that in a lot of cases, right? Like the Oakley Carlson case, we've seen that before, where they get you on these charges to keep you where they want you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's what they did for him. It lasted until basically the end of July. But it was enough time for them to search the house. They brought excavators in. They dug up the fire pit. They dug up, several different locations on the property because they're thinking at this point, they're going to find Nancy's remains. They're going to find her clothes. They're going to find something. So they did all this, they collected a ton of evidence, but, obviously they needed to test it. So what I will say is that they did not find a skeleton or whatever on the property.
Sure.
But they found a lot of things that they wanted to test. They collected those items. They began the testing process. Eric gets released at the end of July. And in August of 2019, he decided to talk.
To whom?
Well, to a podcaster.
Oh, Christ. Okay.
Yeah. Prior.
Why not our podcast?
Because we were not in Washington State, honey.
Okay.
In 2019, doing this.
We're
a year
worldwide.
Before we started the podcast.
We're worldwide.
Oh. Prior to Eric Roberts' confession, a podcaster named James Basinger began digging into Nancy's case.
Kim's little brother.
Stop it. It's not even close. He made it the subject of the first season of his podcast, Hide and Seek. About a month after his stunning confession, Eric sat down with James at his house and told his version of the story. The conversation apparently lasted about 4.5 hours. and James condensed it into an hour-long episode. And it's really interesting. So, like, if you're listening to this, you have to go over to Hide and Seek and listen to that episode. It's episode 12 of season 1, but you know, you should probably just listen to all of season 1 and get like a real deep dive into this case. It's an hour long, you know, we're not going to go through every second of it. So here's the gist. Roberts claimed that he actually called 911 twice. The first time he called was to report an intruder on his property. So his story was that, like, he was hanging out, his dog started barking, he looked, he saw some, like, strange man on his property. He didn't want to get his gun and, like, shoot the guy and get in trouble, so he called 911.
What is the time frame for this? What is this?
So
is this supposedly the night that she went missing?
No. This is July, like, the day he made the confession.
This is just a fucking random phone call.
Yeah. So that's like, this is how he's explaining the confession call to 911. So he says that the whole reason he called 911 in the first place is because he saw this intruder. So he calls 911, makes this report. Then he calls back.
Hey, BT Dubs, I forgot to mention this. Like, I killed this girl.
Yeah.
Like, seriously? That's what he's fucking going with?
Yeah, that's like basically his story. But he says he doesn't remember that. So he says...
Because he was on meds.
Yeah.
Okay.
So he says that he saw this intruder. His dog barked at the intruder. That's how he knew it was real. And he called 911, and then police showed up. So he assumed they were there to investigate the intruder on his property. But then they start asking about Nancy, and they're like, and then he was like, this is weird. Why are you asking me about Nancy when I called you about an intruder? Because what he's saying is he has no recollection of the second call in which he confessed to this 10-year-old murder.
Cool, bro. But 911 calls are recorded, so...
Right. And so that's what James says. He's like, listen, this whole 911 calls is not something that I've ever heard. This is interesting. Let me follow up because, as you know, this is all logged and recorded. So if you call 911 twice, like, that will be on the record. Like, this is not like a difficult thing to figure out. So let me check into this, like, you know, whatever.
Yeah, a FOIA request would prove that.
Honestly, I think that he had like a good enough relationship that he didn't even have to do that. Like,
sure.
I think he literally just was like, hey, did he call twice? Right. And spoiler, no, like, he did not call twice.
So weird.
There was one call. It was that call where he made the confession. So there were 2 calls from his house, but the first call, or, you know, from his location, the first call was the confession call. The second call was after the police got there and they were arresting him. And the police called into to dispatch to get animal control out to get somebody to get his dog, you know, because they got to take care of the dogs, right?
They also don't want to get bit by the dog.
Yeah, also that. So,
or have to shoot the dog if the dog attacks them.
Right. So there were 2 911 calls made, but one was by the police. Only one was made by Eric. So that's nonsense. But that's his story, right? So he thinks that when detectives show up, they're there to investigate this intruder. That's why they took the walk. You know, the police said that they took a walk because he was in the patrol car. He gave his 34-minute recorded confession, freaked out, and they're like, hey, do you want to take a walk? He said yes. Eric's version of the story is they showed up, they took a walk because they're like, hey, show me where you saw this guy. So they end up at the fire pit. Eric's version of the story is he doesn't say anything about the fire pit. The detective says something like, wow, that's a really big fire pit. What's that for? What are you doing with it?
Okay, so he's basically saying that the police pinned this on him. Is that where we're going with this?
Yeah. So, like, the whole quote that I mentioned earlier of, if I were going to dispose of a body, I'd do it here. He said that, they took this walk to look for the intruder. The detective commented on his fire pit. And he did say something along those lines, but he said he was actually referring to himself because he had always had this plan that he had told friends and family of when he died, he wanted to be cremated in that fire pit and go out like a Viking.
Bullshit. I'm sorry. Like he's fucking lying. Like clearly we've already proven that he's lying.
Yeah, and well, he goes on though. So he also says that like he never said that Nancy's clothes were in the basement. He says that they brought up are there clothes in the basement or whatever. And he's like, yeah, there are, but they were his ex-girlfriend Heather's clothes. And then this is where we get back to the coat, the fur-lined coat. He said that the police kept on telling him things like, and I think this is later after they started the search, because they told him things like, we found a zipper in the fire pit. We found faux fur in the fire pit.
Yeah, trying to match it up to the coat.
Yeah. And they're like, what do you have to say about that? Like, how do you explain that? And he was like, I don't have an explanation for that. He's like, I don't know. Maybe I burned something from the garage. Like, I have no idea. I don't know. And so his stance is that the police were bluffing, which honestly, I think they were. But, his stance is that the police were bluffing, and he never said that he had burned like this scarf or like anything in the fire pit. He said that they just came up with that. And that like he never knew Nancy, he never knew her to wear a scarf. He had no idea where that came from. He said that they came up with all of that. Okay.
But there is a recording of him confessing to killing her.
Yeah. And so in this podcast episode, which again, y'all need to listen to, James keeps on saying like, listen, like you're on the 911 recording, like
right.
Confessing, like,
yes,
they didn't make that up. Like you did that. And he's like, well, I don't remember. But he doesn't really bring up the 34-minute recording in the police cruiser.
Right.
Which to me is more compelling, right? Like,
yeah.
Not that I would necessarily believe that somebody would like be on meds and just randomly call up 911 and confess to a cold case that they had nothing to do with. But that's easier to believe than somebody doing that and then making a 34-minute recording in a police cruiser.
Yeah.
If you take out that 34-minute recording in the police cruiser, his story almost seems plausible, right? Because like we've seen cops who've like tried to, make the evidence fit. And, I could see them suggesting these things, saying like, oh yeah, we did this, we did that, we saw this, we saw that.
But okay, but I don't. This is how many years later?
10.
This is 10 years later, and just completely out of the blue, they decide to pin it on this guy, or like push evidence on this guy who was never even a suspect to begin with. No, I don't. I don't see it that way.
Well, there's more to the story. So after he recants his statement and like he's talking to James, the podcaster, he's like, listen, none of this happened. I don't remember making that confession. The police made up most of the stuff that they're saying. I barely knew Nancy, and I've never had a sexual relationship with her. Like, she was just some lady who I worked with. But to your point of like this guy coming out of nowhere, because that's definitely what it seems like, he actually didn't. Eric Roberts was asked about Nancy coming over to his house way back in 2009. So he was interviewed in 2009 with the rest of the coworkers, But even more than that, Nancy had apparently confided in her sister Sharon and told her that when her marriage with Bill was breaking up, so it's like the time where they were splitting up, but she hadn't yet moved out. She would sneak over to Eric's house and meet up with his nephew, Aaron. And remember, Eric's just 3 houses down. It's like less than a quarter of a mile. In 2009, when police asked him about this, because they're like, hey, we've heard that she was seeing your nephew and she came over to your house, da da da. He was like, yeah, she was seeing my nephew, but like, I'm a single dad with 2 kids. Nobody was coming over to my house for sexual encounters. He's like, that was not a thing. This never happened at my house. In 2019, when he was talking to James, the podcaster, like he reiterated this. He's like, yeah, they saw each other, but not at my house. This had nothing to do with me. This had nothing to do with my property. Like it was a whole separate thing. And he said again that he barely knew Nancy and she had a relationship with his nephew, but it had nothing to do with him. However, according to the probable cause affidavit, several years before his confession in 2019, an informant came into the police station and said that he believed that Eric Roberts might have killed Nancy. This informant was a man named Dave, and he was one of Eric's best friends. They had been friends since high school. Unfortunately, Dave died by suicide in, I believe, 2017. But part of the information he gave to police stated that Eric did, in fact, tell him that he had a sexual relationship with Nancy. He also said that they drove by Nancy's house one time and Eric said something like, remember that woman I was seeing who went missing? She lived here. Dave asked him if he knew whatever happened to her, and Eric replied, I may or I may not know. Eric Roberts had been on police's radar in 2009, but not a main suspect, just a guy who perhaps had some connection to her. Then several years later, I want to say this all happened 2012, 2013-ish, 2014 maybe, give or take. Dave comes forward and says like, hey, my friend said some weird things. I don't know. But they didn't have much else to go on. And then in 2019, he confesses and then recants. So that's kind of where we are. When Dave came in and told them this stuff about Eric, it was enough to raise suspicion, but it wasn't enough to arrest Eric Roberts or anything like that. But it was enough that in 2019, it shows that this confession didn't come out of nowhere. So I think this is important because, when this came out in 2019, a lot of people were like, who is this guy? What is happening? Like, we've never heard this name before. But I feel like this is really important to know that he has been on the radar the entire time. The confession didn't really come out of nowhere as it initially appeared. Another thing that didn't come out of nowhere was strangulation.
Okay. This is the first time I'm hearing about this.
Well, no. So he had said that he had accidentally strangled her during rough sex.
Yeah, he said that.
So Eric's second story to police, allegedly, that was not recorded, was that he had accidentally strangled Nancy during rough sex. As it turns out, Eric has a history of this. He has multiple domestic violence charges on his record. And in 2014, detectives interviewed a former girlfriend who said that Eric was like a Jekyll and Hyde when he was drunk. He choked her during sex, but when she said she didn't like it, he stopped and he never tried it again. However, another time they got into a fight and he choked her to the point that she had to rip his hands off her throat and scratch him to get him to stop. She said that she thought she was going to die. And one of his domestic violence arrests was related to her.
So here we have the history of that.
Yeah. And in addition, Eric's son also said that his dad choked him during an argument. So James brought this up like in that podcast episode that I mentioned, and Eric was like, well, the domestic violence charges got dropped. He's like, these were all very different situations, very different people. You got to take it on a case-by-case basis. Like,
no, you don't, because your actions were the fucking same.
Right. So there's a pattern, but Eric denies that pattern exists.
He also denies that he made a confession, even though it's recorded.
Yeah. So where does the case stand now?
They didn't turn up anything from the searches. Nothing tangible, nothing usable.
No, not so far. Nancy's youngest daughter, Sam, worked with James on the podcast, and she runs the Where is Nancy Moyer Facebook page, which, we'll have linked. She posts photos and memories of her mother, along with information about her case. In 2021, someone asked about the status of the items taken from Eric's house back in 2019. Sam replied, quote, "No DNA was found on the first group of items we sent in, which is why Eric hasn't been convicted and is a free guy right now. We're waiting on more items to be tested." End quote. In that same thread, someone else asked about Jim Roth. Sam said that he never was officially cleared, but that he was, quote, "the main suspect in a lot of people's minds until Eric's confession," end quote. As of this recording in September of 2022, no one has been charged with Nancy Moyer's murder. On July 12th of this year, Sam posted, quote, "3 years ago, Eric Lee Roberts confessed to my mom's murder. These pictures are from the press conference we had right outside the courtroom where he recanted his confession, claiming he doesn't remember saying any of what he said. 3 years later, and he's still a free man," end quote. In the comment section of that post, Nancy's friend and tireless advocate, Bev Poston, revealed yet another connection between Eric and Nancy. He came to one of their searches. She wrote, quote, "I believe in my heart that he got drunk and finally had to purge himself of this guilt over killing Nancy. I remember him telling me when he showed up at one of our searches after she disappeared that he was a family friend and was there so he could report back to the family about what we were doing. He later stated he barely knew her even though you all lived only a few houses away from him. He realized he confessed after he sobered up, knew he was in deep shit, and immediately recanted his confession, even though he contacted law enforcement out of the blue with no prompting. Not finding any physical evidence connecting him to Nancy is why he is free. Karma is a bitch, and I know his day of judgment is coming," end quote. For the record, I do want to say that after his confession, Bill actually did say that he didn't know Eric, even though they did live only 3 houses apart. Like, they were far enough away. Like, he didn't know him. He definitely was not a family friend. He definitely was not at that search to report back to the family or anything like that.
So a potential killer inserting himself into a search to try and find the body.
Yeah, potentially.
This town is fucked up.
Yeah, it's real tiny.
Like, sorry, like there should not be this many suspects that are this close and like,
yeah, and this viable, right?
Yes.
I mean, like, these are viable suspects, like many of them.
Yeah.
At the end of 2019, Eric tried to sell the property where many people think that Nancy Moyer was murdered. It didn't sell, surprisingly, and he took it off the market in early 2020. According to Sam, items from both Nancy's home and Eric's are still being tested, but so far, nothing has turned up that points to any suspect. What we have right now is a lot of talk and suspicions, but still no hard evidence related to Nancy Moyer's fate. But Sam and Bev and the rest of the people who love Nancy aren't giving up. As Sam said in her first post on her mom's page, quote, "Her case continues to be unsolved, and we're going to find out what happened and find out where she is. It's just a matter of time." Nancy Moyer has been missing from Tenino, Washington since March 6, 2009. She is a white woman with brown hair and brown eyes. She was 4'11" and approximately 115 pounds. She has several tattoos and a scar on her right knee. Her ears and her navel are pierced. Nancy was 36 years old when she went missing. She would be 49 today. If you have any information regarding the disappearance of Nancy Moyer or of any of the persons of interest in this case, please call the Thurston County Sheriff's Office at 360-786-5279. You can see all the sources for this episode along with photos and videos at our website, andthentheyweregone.com.
And be sure to follow us on social, and Then They Were Gone Pod on Facebook and at ATTWG Pod on Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter. If you like what we're doing, please subscribe and consider leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. It will help new listeners find us. And the more people that listen, the more chances we have of bringing someone home.
And we'll see you here next week for a brand new episode.
See you next week.
And Then They Were Gone is hosted by Kona Gallagher and Ethan Flick. All research, writing, and editing is done by Kona Gallagher. Theme music is The Stork by Ketsa. Additional music is provided by Kai Engel. And Then They Were Gone is a Little Monster production.
Hey, you can do it!